We'll get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Erin Graff Zivin. I'm chair of the Department of Comparative Literature here at USC. I had the pleasure of working with Peggy for almost a decade. I'm going to be very brief because we have many wonderful speakers today who have collaborated with Peggy extensively over the years. So I am going to limit my remarks. In 1997, our colleague and friend, Peggy Kamuf, wrote the following: "The single, irreplaceable truth about deconstruction, but also about absolutely anything, supposed to stand at an infinite remove from the movement of substitution, which is to say of writing, cannot but be overtaken by the movement of its own inscription. And with that movement, places shift, reverse, collapse, but also something else gets inscribed, a displacement of the truth in writing and by writing. And this displacement is anything but a destruction or a disappearance. On the contrary, it represents an altogether unprecedented demand for the written truth, the literal truth, the truth of literature and for its teaching." And that comes from, of course, the division of literature or the university in deconstruction. And I came across this recently as I was returning to the question of truth, which has been so urgent today. And I have found Peggy's words so important in my own rethinking of our relation to the truth in the university and beyond. Peggy's scholarly work, translations, pedagogy, and administrative work have exhibited a commitment to the truth and its teaching. She is known, of course, as one of the foremost scholars and translators of the work of Jacques Derrida, but here at USC, she helped to found and then served as director of a brand new PhD program in comparative studies in literature and culture at a time when humanities programs were being starved or outright eliminated. So it's really a pleasure to celebrate her work today. Many of you have collaborated with her on the academic work, especially on the translation projects. But I really want to emphasize that here at USC, she also had a fundamental role, not only in the classroom, but really making the institution what it should be. And I hope that we can continue to work in that spirit. I want to thank the departments of comparative literature, French and Italian, and Spanish and Portuguese, the Comparative Studies in Literature and Culture doctoral program, the Francophone Research and Resource Center, USC Dornsife Office of the Dean, and the USC School of Cinematic Arts for their generous support of this event. Thank you as well to my colleagues Akira Lippit, Natanya Meeker, Ronald Mendoza-de Jesús, and our tireless department administrators, Bertha Delgado, and especially Deborah Romero. Deborah, are you here? She may be outside, who has done so much work to make sure that today happened. It is my pleasure to introduce Akira Mizuta Lippit, Vice Dean of Faculty in the School of Cinematic Arts, Professor in the Division of Cinema and Media Studies, and Professor of Comparative Literature and East Asian Languages and Cultures in the USC Dornsife College. So welcome to all of you, and welcome to Aki.
Thank you, Erin. There's no need to clap for me. I'm just going to say a few opening remarks and echo Erin's welcome to everybody here. This is an opportunity for us who have known Peggy and worked with her and interacted with her across a very long period of time and in so many different capacities to celebrate all that she has done for us, all that she's contributed to our intellectual and scholarly lives. And I will do my best to restrain my distress, because those of us who are local here will know exactly what Peggy's retirement means to the programs that she has been so crucial in not only maintaining and growing, but in fact, as Erin said, creating and inventing. Erin mentioned the year 1997, and I realized that was when I first met Peggy in 1997. It was at I was a very precocious 17-year-old at the time. And it was my first experience in this kind of milieu. I also met Jeff there. And it was, sorry, why do I say things like that? Those of you who've been in these spaces, and I know many of you have, and especially when Jacques Derrida is there is a kind of energy and a frenzy and a kind of tension which is incredibly productive and exhilarating, but can also be incredibly disruptive. And I remember meeting Peggy, somebody whose work I had admired for a very long time, and meeting Jeff and others who were there, people whose work I had read and learned from. And Peggy was so welcoming and calm and generous. And I thought, this is a model. This is a model for being somebody who's so essential and so important in this space, in the kind of economy that unfolds around an event like this. I remember one of the first things she said to me was, "Oh, I've heard a lot about you." And I thought, how could you have heard a lot about me? I've written that, published. It was this incredible generosity. Over the years, I've come to see that generosity and that sense of a certain, I say calm because that might not be the right signifier in this context, but an ability to be within a space, to be essential and crucial to it, but also to open it up for others to enter into. And this is a feature that I've seen her provide, a kind of space that I've seen her provide over and again, especially for our graduate students. In fact, that was the beginning of my relationship with Peggy. And within a few years, she began to approach me about the possibility of coming to USC. I can say categorically, I came here because Peggy made this happen. It was really her creation. And since coming here, I've come to see the ways in which she has made so many things happen and occur, always in a way that doesn't position herself at the center of something. As Erin mentioned, when the current PhD program, which I think is really the jewel of the college and of the humanities at USC, came about, it was initially under the threat of closure. Right? We were under incredible assault. And Peggy was there. She didn't back down, but she didn't turn it into a kind of hysterical battle either. And very calmly, under her leadership, we reorganized the departments. We brought Spanish and Portuguese into the PhD program, built alliances, made the humanities stronger. And I don't think the administration to this day realized that they lost this battle, because Peggy was able, and all of the allies that organized around her were able to kind of present it to them in a way that they thought they were getting something, because I think their initial move was to close departments, to eliminate programs, and to do so. And this is something that I think that I've seen Peggy do in so many occasions when we're organizing the list of invitees, who are really only a fraction of the people that have spent meaningful time with Peggy in one capacity or another. You just realize the expanse and the number of different configurations with which the relationships around Peggy have formed, the kind of constellation around her work, from students to collaborators to peers to colleagues and allies from many generations, many different iterations, and in many different places and venues. And I think it's very special for all of us to be able to gather here in a moment that, for those of us, I said, who are local, will always be bittersweet, but for the rest of us should be merely celebratory, not only for everything that Peggy has contributed and given to all of us, but what we anticipate as future gifts and contributions that she will continue to make, both as a member of this community and the larger intellectual community. So this is an opportunity to really express our thanks, which is what I would like to do personally to Peggy for all she's done for me and for the community of which I'm a part, for all the folks who are assembled here who are part of this institution. And really, this is a gift, because Peggy has never demanded or asked for anything in return. So we are forcing this event upon her as an opportunity to simply express our gratitude and our appreciation or our admiration for Peggy Kamuf. So with that, I would like to just open the event and really enjoy the rest of the day with everybody. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Aki. I'd like to invite David Wills, Ronald Mendoza-de Jesús, and Ellen Burt to come to the front of the room for the first panel of the morning. I'll bring a microphone over just in a moment. First, I'll introduce David.
Behind the flowers?
Yes, yeah, I'll sit behind the flowers.
I'm going to move this microphone over.
So I'll speak from the table.
These two microphones
No, I like
will
the
be
flowers.
working. And then this little microphone here is just for the video recording.
Okay, Ronald, while I speak, I'll be here.
So it's a pleasure to introduce David Wills, Professor of French Studies and Comparative Literature at Brown University. Wills specializes in modernist literature as well as film theory and comparative literature. His most recent book is In Animation. It was published in 2016 by Mizuta. It is the third in a series to analyze the technology of the human, following Cliff's thesis from Stanford, 1995, and Dorsality, also Minnesota, 2008. In prosthesis, he traced the human attachment to external objects back to a necessity within the body itself. In Dorsality, he explored how technology is understood to function behind or before the human. In Animation proceeds by taking literally the idea of inorganic forms of life and starting from a seemingly naive question about what it means to say that texts live on, to propose a new theory of the inanimate, discovering life forms in such disparate places as the act of thinking, the death drive, poetic blank space, recorded bird songs, the technology of warfare, and the heart stopped by love. Wills is, of course, also known as a major translator and interpreter of the work of Derrida, The Gift of Death, Right of Inspection, Counterpath, and The Animal That Therefore I Am. He has authored a volume of essays on Derrida called Matchbook, published by Stanford in 2005, and is a member, along with several others today, of the Derrida Seminars Translation Project. His new book project analyzes the temporal technology of the death penalty, called Killing Times, which Fordham University Press will publish soon. It concentrates on how the attempt by capital punishment to determine and manage the timing and instant of death leads to surprising paradoxes. The treatment of the death penalty as temporal technology brings into focus the impasse of US Supreme Court arguments regarding cruel and unusual punishment, and brings into the ambit of capital punishment extrajudicial execution by drone and suicide bombing. Please join me in welcoming David Wills.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Erin, for the generous introduction. Thank you, Peggy, for being Peggy and allowing us to be here, inviting us here. And thanks to all the organizers for arranging this bittersweet event, shall we say. So my paper is called Double Hand, and surprisingly, it is for Peggy Kamuf. How did I do?
Pretty good.
I've been working on that for 30 years. This short reflection is written in 2 columns. If they had titles, one might be Peggy, the other, I carefully pronounced, Kamuf. Ideally, I would read the 2 columns so that you heard them simultaneously, and even more ideally, the 2 columns would not be assigned a side, a Peggy on the left and a Kamuf on the right. Indeed, they might as easily be 2 horizontal columns dividing the page into a top and bottom half. I don't even know if what you will hear is in fact written, whether it is yet ready to be mise en page. As you do know, there are noble precedents for my enterprise. Jacques Derrida famously wrote a book called Glas, consisting of 2 columns. He also wrote an article, Living on Borderlines, consisting of the main text, with a footnote running beneath it from start to finish. My plan here, far less noble in its intent, if not its subject, but hoping to rise to the occasion of the celebration of Peggy Kamuf's long and illustrious career, is to combine some personal reminiscences with a few remarks that seek to do justice to that career, albeit a minute representative part of it. In the interests of justice, but anyone who knows Derrida and his force of law will immediately understand that I am here applying a law that is far from an undeconstructible justice. In the interests of a type of justice, I'll rigorously limit myself to two equal parts, Peggy and Kamuf. 5 typescript pages devoted to each, but not in that order. And I'll read them as alternating pages. At the end of Kamuf's book of addresses, as 15th chapter of a long series of remarkable pieces, there is a doubly particular text called Singular Sense, Second Hand. I call it doubly particular to allude to its title and conceit, but also to note what will be for me, in this brief reading of it on this special occasion, 2 particulars. 1, there is something of a Peggy in it, but 2, Kamuf is at her inimitable best. The Peggy is an autobiographical watch with second-hand story. She confesses that it is autobiographical some 5 pages in, after it all, in a sense, once the storytelling is over. And I quote, "Why tell you the story of a second hand? And why tell it in the third person as if it did not happen to me, but to another?" End of quote. Because the second hand in the second hand story is really a hyphen that links that story to the rest of the discussion, which will range through Gachet and Gachet's Derrida, before commenting on Nancy's Heidegger's Mitsein, about which more in a minute or two. And it is also a mobile hyphen. First, because her hyphen moves as if on a dial or face to become a dash or a slash, or disappear by coinciding with grander markers, rendering it functionally highly problematic. Second, because as she explains via the etymology, her hyphen, like any hyphen, quote, both joins what it separates and separates what it joins, end of quote. Here today, gone tomorrow, here 1 second, gone the next, here on one hand, gone on the next. And beyond all that visual mobility, which only an Eric Partridge or a Chicago Manual of Style can resolve, there is this, which only a Kamuf can persist in, the fact that the question of the hyphen echoes through its own silence to be an unspoken mark of punctuation about which she will have the temerity to ask, quote, what does it mean to overhear a hyphen? The year was 1986 or 1987, which means, yes, about, I wrote 40, but I think it's only 30 years ago. I was in Baton Rouge, busted flat as ever, and a common friend, hearing that I was going to attend the annual 20th Century French Studies Conference, then it was neither also 21st century, nor also Francophone Studies, said that I had to make contact with Peggy Kamuf. I did, still am, having to. I determined that she was participating in a panel on Glas under some sort of auspices of David Carroll. He sounded to me like a big shot. She sounded like a long shot. I mean, why would she pay me any attention? Aki's same problem. So I fronted up to the session and ingratiated myself with a long, incoherent pseudo-question that essentially took all the panelists to task for not rising to the writing challenge of Derrida's Glas. That was my thing at the time. How to reconfigure academic writing in a way that was equal to the challenge of theory. It is still my thing, somewhat. And I'm sure if I had another chance to address David Carroll's Glas session, I'd make my case more convincingly. And I'd do a much better job of a first impression for a Peggy. But there you have it. We do what we can when we can. I think if I had been her, I would have taken some serious distance from the upstart with the weird accent and pretentious sounding question. As it happened, she didn't. Really. She really didn't. I remember hanging out with her on the fringes of the post-session thing, perhaps it was a dinner, and I remember how kindly she made room for me in that complicated articulation of academic space. And the rest is our 30-year friendship, which will be shattered by only one thing and only one thing, were she ever to take it into her head to tell her version and her side of that first bumbling encounter. That would certainly be unforgivable, and I would certainly have to forgive her. What does it mean to overhear a hyphen? Both, as I understand Kamuf, to inadvertently hear a hyphen, to hear it out of one ear unbeknownst to it, and to hear more than it says, overhear it in the sense of understanding or over-understanding or over-interpreting it. That may be what she has been doing from the time she received the gift of a watch with comment regarding some second hand. Filling in gaps in hearing or understanding, filling in gaps in hearing or understanding with fecund traits of writing. Inventing her own special organ or prosthetic machine, quote, set to read the hyphenating pulse, end of quote. Who, apart from Kamuf, ever danced to the beat of a hyphen? But once that we are joined with and enjoined by her meditation on the hyphen, who among us does not sense its rhythm? Kamuf's particular purchase on the hyphen is expressed as this hypothesis, quote, hyphenation makes room for or gives place to a mark that arrests the disappearance of a singular sense at the limit of common sense, common language, the rule of the under and into one, end of quote. It becomes, therefore, a place of resistance, not the struggle over whether to place a hyphen or resist placing a hyphen, but rather how to finesse and comprehend with finesse the articulation that both divides and connects the singular and the common. Nothing can be singular to the point of being unintelligible, just out there but totally unseen and unheard. At least, that is what Gachet is contending in the passage Kamuf lights upon. But it would be betraying the radicalism of Derrida's thinking, which is what Gachet has under consideration, not to allow Derrida's questioning concerning singularity to extend all the way to an irremediable, unheard of destabilization of intelligibility. Listen for that, suggests Kamuf, for the silent tick of an inaudible hyphen. A couple of years later, I've been translating my first piece of Derrida. It's called Right of Inspection. I've been in touch with Peggy regarding this and that in the interim, but I can't remember what this or that is or was. Perhaps we have met up again somewhere, but my current CV doesn't reveal it. In any case, a version of my translation has appeared in an Australian journal, now defunct, and Derrida has responded by sending me a copy of the Italian journal where he first published his Che cos'è la poesia. There is a strangely seductive photograph of him looking right at me, and anyone else who cares to put themselves in the position of the addressee. In the margin, he has written something to the effect that he would like us to meet. I've actually met him a couple of times already, but there would be no reason for him to remember. Cut to Paris. It must have been summer of 1989, I think. In retrospect, I'm not sure why I'm there, but in retrospect, I am there so that Peggy can contact me to tell me Derrida would like us to meet, which we do. At the cafe next to the École des Hautes Études, Peggy is from memory drinking tonic water, as is Jacques from memory. I don't have any particular recollection of what we talked about. There's not a lot to be said or told, except, once again, the level of unassuming hospitality on the part of Jacques on his side and Peggy on hers. It is then for the first time that I have the sense of community as it applies to the group or a group of people who congregated around Jacques Derrida. Not that I felt I belonged to that group, not then at least, but I would progressively come over the next 4 or 5 years up to and around the 1992 Cerisy Passage des Frontières conference to know that I had found many more and many times more than one friend. Singular sense, second hand, derives from a 1996 Aberdeen conference on sensual reading, which gave birth to a book in 2001. If you now Google sensual reading, you'll find that the book vies for attention with erotic literature, much of it destined for a female readership. To be read silently or out loud, I wondered, encountering for the first time the ubiquitous flowering of this genre in the era of internet porn. I also wondered about silence in relation to reading because of something that struck me in a powerful paper that Peggy gave at the Bookends conference, which I helped organize in 2000, about how post-childhood silent reading came to be the norm as a function of the shift, or hyphenated transition, disconnected connection, from devotional to literary forms and genres of the clericalism that keeps us defined still here. I was struck specifically by the scene she quoted of Augustine watching Ambrose going silently at it back in the 4th century. Within that structure of clericalism, the cleric hyphenates into a clerk, like those whose betrayal Julien Banda bemoaned in his famous 1927 book, La Trahison des Clercs, the Treason of the Intellectuals. That book was republished in 2006 with an introduction by Roger Kimball, which is really a reprint of his, Kimball's, 1992 New Criterion review of the 1987 rehash of Banda by Alain Finkielkraut. I'll pronounce it that way. The Undoing of Thought. In it, Finkielkraut loudly and predictably proclaims the sins of the postmodernists without even so much as a hyphen, the greatest of which sins being, in Banda's terms, passion. For those listening carefully for the sound of a hyphen, Kamuf had much more better to say when she took on those quaint old cultural warriors in the Division of Literature or the University in Deconstruction. I say quaint old for people like Kimball because I doubt they are currently assured of having got their revenge. In the summer of 2000, this time I remember much more precisely, like in the poem by William Carlos Williams, my more or less English mother utters her more or less last words about the house and garden she has lived in since before I was born, saying more or less, shrubs, well, I'm tired of them, and rolling her head away. I thought I had some time on my hands, so I went down there to assist her in her transition to assisted living. What I didn't think I had time for was Peggy's request, coming from Paris, that I assist in the transition of a Serbian friend of hers from Budapest to Albany, New York. It all seemed way more complicated than it was worth, especially because my relation to SUNY Albany at that time was fraught with preoccupations about a certain colleague's interference in, well, everything, but particularly in the organization of the conference called Bookends that was designed to change the world, or at least register how the world was changing vis-a-vis print culture. Eventually, I replied to Peggy that, yes, okay, I can help out. In fact, because I was substantially in and out of Albany, her friend could stay for a few days in my apartment upon her arrival. I came back to the US. The contentieux with my colleague was duly resolved at the beginning of the semester, and Bookends began and ended successfully. Peggy was there, and Jacques, and Jeff, and others. Peggy's friend arrived wearing a green leather jacket. She had her hands in the pockets. It struck me without forethought that she appeared quite striking. She stayed with me until she found her own apartment, but stayed with me. Still stays with me. Is still my stay and solid anchor. Those are the things that Peggy does for me. Kraut. Yes, I'll soon get him out of my head. Worries that, quote, an effective publicity slogan counts for as much as a poem by Apollinaire or Francis Ponge, end of quote. Perhaps he has read Apollinaire's Liens, Links, the epigraphic text of Calligramme, Poems of Peace and War, 1913 to 1916. In that poem, Apollinaire cites various links, chords, then sounds of bells, rails, even rain, before returning to, quote, chords, my bad translation, woven cords, submarine cables, towers of Babel changed into bridges, end of quote. Then in the poem comes this remarkable line composed of two words, araignée pontife, spiders, pontiffs, or spider pontiffs. It is a surrealist juxtaposition. Remember, it was Apollinaire who coined the word surrealist. Is it an open or closed compound word according to the conventions that Kamuf examines? Or indeed, a syntactogrammic combination, where one syntactic unit has meaning only in conjunction with another word, such as Kamuf also analyzes in the article. Whenever I teach this poem to my students, I ask them, with whom I have already read the calligrammatic Il pleut, with its words falling in droplets down the page, I ask them what to make of this araignée pontife. There's a hyphen between the two words. And whether we should be paying attention to anything in particular in relation to it, in relation to how it relates the two words. I want them, of course, to tell me that Apollinaire has drawn the line of a hyphen, drawn a trait d'union, as the French say, in the middle of his poem, which is entitled Links, graphically linking these two words in the middle and pictorially linking the poem's top half to its bottom half. After that, I can go on to talk about this trait tearing between these two words and train, or trains, tearing along at the speed Apollinaire was so fascinated with that he didn't see it coming as a piece of shrapnel lodged in his skull and rendered him susceptible to the Spanish flu that took him off 2 days before the armistice. If I now go to the handful of emails that I have saved from the almost 15 years I spent at SUNY Albany, I can find two from October the 9th, 2004. The first marked aucun objet in chevrons from a friend in Paris. The second marked no subject in parentheses from Peggy in Los Angeles. No, I think it should be quotation marks. They announced, when I woke up to them that sunny Sunday, October morning, that Jacques Derrida had died. I remember the dullness of the shock and how it persisted as a fog out of which I found myself 3 days later crowded with many other familiar and not so familiar faces in a room on the Rue d'Ulm, having absolutely no idea what to say. I found Peggy there, and I had absolutely no idea what to say to her, but I felt better saying it and staying in her proximity. At a certain point, this all sounds now like a text by Blanchot. Without really knowing what we were doing, a kind of space opened, and we found ourselves descending the stairs we had noticed others descending, down to an empty corridor next to the room where Jacques' body was laid out. We were alone there. Marguerite, Pierre, and Jean were in the room, so we waited outside. Eventually they emerged, and Marguerite indicated matter-of-factly that we should feel free to enter and pay our respects. Peggy and I held each other somehow and went in. It is true that everyone needs their moment, but we went in together because that is the way that it was happening. We were still in a text by Blanchot, and I had no words, no resources, no strategy other than the utmost passivity. Jacques' body, Jacques' dead body, was then utmost passivity. In utmost passivity, who knows who is dead or alive? Who knows who is holding or being held? Who is holding whom? How or for what? Against what? In that, for me, it will always have been Peggy. Kamuf brings up the trait when she comes to Nancy in the latter part of her chapter. It allows her to refer to a, quote, graphic imperative, whereby Nancy bears on Heidegger's privileging of Dasein at the expense of anything more than a sketchy Mitsein, itself haunted by the destiny of a folk, the ideologically charged recourse that threatens to overshadow Heidegger's entire enterprise. He, Nancy, bears down on it with two hands or two strokes of the pen that would redesign Heidegger's analytic in terms of a co-originarity that at the same time risks, this is Kamuf's intervention, an idiom of the entre nous that is, quote from Kamuf, imperceptible for outsiders, end of quote. In other words, on one hand, a redrawn Mitsein might develop out of Heidegger the whole other sense of community that Nancy elaborates throughout much of his most important work. But on the other hand, his withness runs the risk of another form of exclusivity. Though we never really go back there, we are, at this point, by the end of Kamuf's essay, back in the familial scene of the beginning, in the space of misunderstanding and potential rupture between second and hand. That space for her, let's call her Peggy again, a space in which everything familiar fell apart into a type of mistrust, was a space from out of which she found the means to escape her idiomatic confines and launch into adventure, into the vistas, her word, the vistas without address that have been called, among other things, deconstruction. Her tripping over the mother tongue tells us that she experienced the risks she identifies in Nancy, that she has traversed both ways the rigorous logic of the hyphen of being with. And her extraordinarily deft linking of a Peggy to a Kamuf, exposed in her essay, proves the impeccable class of her writing, held together singly double-handed signature. So Peggy decides she will retire from teaching. That loss, we tell ourselves, immediately felt most by her students and colleagues here at USC, will be compensated for by the additional time she is able to spend on her writing and other research-related activities. Those of us associated with her most formally in the Derrida's Seminar Publication and Translation Project console ourselves with the continued proof of her busyness, her selfless attention to the organization and oversight of our annual corroboree, already on it for next July. Last July, we celebrated the 10th anniversary of the translation workshop, and amidst the jollity and the Abbaye's staff's fretful surveillance of Ronald's irrepressible gourmandise, we sent Peggy off on a cruise. Cruise off, Peggy, we said. Cruise along and cruise on back and continue making plain sailing for our annual event. You are the plain sail maker. I'm not sure how well she heard all of that, whether she went about and ticked off, mumbling, those bastards, if they think I'm going to do this forever, they're sadly mistaken. But it seems we have her on deck again this coming year. After 10 years, 13 years after Derrida's death, the whole seminars project is poised to enter a new phase. On one side or the other of the Atlantic, the fundamental role played by Peggy in the dissemination of deconstruction will continue to be recognized. And on one hand and the other of the double game in science that is how writing opens in the wake of Derrida's thinking, and in Peggy's analysis of that and so many other things. The only sound waiting and deserving to be heard is joined and conjoined hands applauding acclamation of everything she has taught us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. It's a pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Ronald Mendoza-de Jesús, who is assistant professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese here at USC. And I have to say that the fact that Ronald has joined the faculty here at USC has kept Peggy's departure. I would say it's made sure that it's merely kind of a situation of desperation and not a situation of complete crisis. So we're glad to have Ronald with us. Ronald received his PhD in comparative literature from Emory University. He's currently turning his dissertation into not one, but two book manuscripts. He's working on the first book project currently, Reading Danger, Literary History After Historicism. As the title suggests, Reading Danger sets out to reimagine literary history after historicism. What if, rather than approaching literary texts as reflecting the past as it actually happened, we expanded the historical dimension of literature beyond its capacity to illustrate an epoch? This book takes up this challenge in three different ways. One, by theorizing literary history anew as a dangerous way of engaging with the literary archive. Two, by proposing a deconstructive genealogy of historicism, tracing its roots back to Aristotelian philosophy and diagnosing its recent reemergence in the work of theorists such as Frank Ankersmit and Haydn White. And three, by engaging with the literary modernism of Latin American authors Jorge Luis Borges and Julia de Burgos, whose poetry calls into question historicism's understanding of time and history. And after finishing this manuscript, Ronald plans to work on the second book project, provisionally titled Unworldly Islands, Rethinking Dispossession in Caribbean Modernism. Ronald.
Thank you. I want to begin by thanking Erin, Natania, Aki, Deborah, and Bertha for all the work that went into the organization of this event. And I want to thank all the friends of Peggy who have traveled here to Los Angeles to join us in this celebration of her remarkable career at USC. My paper is a little bit, it may be a little bit of a bumpy ride. Unfortunately, it won't be as smooth sailing as David's, but I will go straight into it. I hope you have a handout, right? So the title of my paper is Addressing Departure, An Impossible Gift. And this is a little bit funny because yesterday we were having dinner and Peggy was precisely bemoaning the departing nature of this event. So I was like, oh my God, here we go. But as its epigraph, I have selected a phrase, and this will be doubly intense, that recurs at least twice in the writings of an old friend of Peggy, Werner Hamaker, who, as many of you know, passed away last July. The phrase is the following: Was geschieht, ist Abschied. For the moment, I will leave this phrase untranslated, if such a thing is possible. I said if such a thing is possible, for I may have already begun to engage in translation from the moment in which I took this sentence out of its rather complicated context and put it at the beginning of this paper. This would be especially true if our concept of translation registered the possibilities that would open up if we were to translate the letter and perhaps also the spirit of the Latinate English word translation back to its etymon, namely the Latin noun translatio, which is defined in Lewis and Short as a carrying or removing from one place to another, a transporting, transferring. And yet it may well be that, as Peggy suggests in her essay, Passing Strange, The Loss of Translation, il ne se passe rien when translation is figured as a passage, since the very concept of translation as a form of passage is part and parcel of logocentrism in all its permutations. With regards to the matter at hand, Peggy's claim would suggest that a translation of this passage of Hamaker that would be worthy of the name would not have simply begun because the passage has been translated in the sense of being transferred, transported, transplanted to this foreign context. And perhaps here emerges one of the major differences between what Benjamin would call Zitierbarkeit, citability, and Übersetzbarkeit, or translatability. And yet, as Peggy also reminds us in this essay, this il ne se passe rien may not be merely negative. At stake, whatever the common definition of translation as a form of passage, and especially as a kind of passage that enables a meaning that is presumed to pre-exist and to be independent from its inscription within a language, to traverse seamlessly the space that separates so-called natural languages. So whatever this common definition of translation as a form of passage comes to an impasse, maybe precisely what is at stake here, maybe precisely the possibility of a different understanding of translation, which would unfold within, and I quote, a strange medium that suspends a meaning and its country, in which the very possibility of passing a meaning enters an impasse. The becoming impossible of the possibility of passage, the experience of translation as an aporia, holds in suspense the possibility of another possibility for translation, for a translation that this time would be attuned, and I quote again, to the impossibility of a faithfulness without reserve, to the demand that would be placed before the translation by its unconditional law of hospitality. I will return to this issue of when and how does any translation in the more robust sense that Peggy imagines in this essay begins. And we will consider this urgent question in my paper, not only in the context of the translation of this phrase of Hamaker, but also of a poem of Puerto Rican poet Julia de Burgos, a reading of which I would like to sketch out today that would take its bearings from Peggy's work on address, love, and the impossibilities thereof, most beautifully committed to writing in her remarkable book of addresses. But before I turn to these more serious matters, allow me to make a confession of sorts. More than a confession, it would be something like an aveu, an admission. I am aware that both my main title and my choice of epigraph, and Peggy made this abundantly clear yesterday, err on the side of explicitness. They both exhibit, perhaps too obscenely, the reason why we are gathered here, namely to mark Peggy's retirement from the University of Southern California, where until last May, she was the Marion Frances Chevalier Professor of French and Professor of Comparative Literature and English. From the moment Erin asked me to present today, I've been thinking about the question that is virtually inscribed in the title, the main title of my paper, namely, how does one address a departure? Moreover, how does one address a departure, perhaps departure in general, if there is such a thing, in the singular context of addressing Peggy's departure from a university to which I came, like so many of us, drawn by her presence, by her thinking, and in my very fortunate case, by her friendship and mentoring, which preceded and have accompanied me to this day for the last 2 years of my stay in Los Angeles. Before continuing on this line of thought, another confessional digression. I hope I won't violate any of the many unwritten laws of academic life in the US by telling you that around the same time as I was a candidate for my current position in our university, I was also a candidate for a job at another major research university in that other major American city that is located on that other coast. As I thought about how life would be in that other city if I was offered that job, I couldn't help the thought that one of the ways in which my life would be different would have something to do with the fact that that other city has self-proclaimed queens of theory, one in the Upper East Side, the other around Washington Square. As it often happens when new people enter the orbit of powerful sovereigns, I imagine that at some point I would have to face the unwelcome demand to bend the knee before any of these majesties. What a striking contrast, I thought, with the situation in this anarchic territory of the City of Angels, where Peggy, the rightful queen of theory and of the humanities, has done everything she can to resist the erection of any such kingdom, perhaps because she has understood and lived better than most of us those lines from La Différence, in which Derrida writes that what he calls La Différence ne commande rien, ne règne sur rien, et n'exerce nulle part aucune autorité, adding soon after that the thinking of La Différence fomente la subversion de tout royaume. Committed as I am, however foolishly and blindly, to a task that Derrida refers to in many of his later texts as the dissociation of the unconditional, l'éventuel ou le possible événement de l'inconditionnel impossible, le tout autre, from what he calls in L'Université sans conditions l'idée théologique de souveraineté, my choice of university and of cities was as clear as the choice between a sovereign and a friend and a thinker of the unconditional urgency to resist the sovereign drive for mastery. And yet, this little anecdote only renders a question I posed a minute ago all the more difficult to answer, for how could I address Peggy's departure from a university when my own decision to be here within the walls of this campus is in more than one way linked to Peggy's own presence extramuros in the city of angels, who will speak of departure when whoever takes leave continues in the wake of its retreat to encourage those who remain within the space that has been left behind to not only continue to occupy the space, but also to do so in such a way that they take up, each time uniquely, the task of preventing the borders, in this case of a university, from collapsing upon themselves and constituting a sovereign circle. To retreat as if seeking shelter from this question, but also in order to approach it from a different angle, I want to return to the sentence of Hamaker that I selected as my epigraph, what das Geschicht ist Abschied. This phrase occurs at least twice in Hamaker's corpus, for the first time that I'm aware of in a short and untranslated essay published in 1985, I believe, under the rather long title of Über einige Unterschiede zwischen der Geschichte literarische und der Geschichte phänomenale Ereignisse. And it then resurfaced more than 2 decades later in Hamaker's remarkable 95 Thesen zur Philologie, so the thesis on philology, in which this sentence occupies the entire space that Hamaker devotes to thesis 34. In the English version of Hamaker's thesis on philology, this sentence is translated as "what happens is parting." I would like to formulate an alternative translation, since, to borrow from one of Peggy's many brilliant idiomatic expressions, something passes strange in this translation, or rather something fails to pass strange. Something passes, in fact, too smoothly here. And let it be said in passing that Peggy's way of turning idioms, especially English idioms such as to pass strange, into unavoidable sites for the possibility of a thought always bowed to the singular is one of the key features, I would say, of Peggy's signature as a thinker and, dare I say, as a poet. At first sight, the translation of Was geschieht ist Abschied as what happens is parting seems correct enough, since the choice of the English noun parting to translate the German Abschied, which from the outset seems to be the only possible source of friction between the original and the translation, retains a reference to the two major semantic areas that the German Abschied covers. On the one hand, like the German verb scheiden, from which we get nouns like entscheiden, right, decision, which is at the basis of Abschied. The English word parting refers to the action of separating, of splitting something from something else, or of establishing a division within a whole, as in the parting of the Red Sea. On the other hand, the English word also conveys what is perhaps the most common sense of the German noun, namely the action of leaving someone or of being separated from something, as in the famous lines from Romeo and Juliet, parting is such sweet sorrow that I'll say goodnight until tonight becomes tomorrow. And yet the pertinence of this translation becomes questionable the moment we step beyond a strictly speaking semantic register and begin to examine this phrase from the purview of other dimensions of language. For instance, consider what occurs when the noun parting, which by itself cannot be distinguished from the present participle of the verb to part, that is, parting, is placed right after the third person singular verb is. Although the syntax of this phrase seems to be faithful to the order of the German original, it actually generates a grammatical form, namely the present continuous, he, she, it, they, is parting, that is not only absent in the German, but that may also run counter to what is most aporetic and thus compelling about Hamaker's understanding of the event or of the occasion as the departing side of a departure. For I would contend that what Hamaker invites us to think with this phrase is not simply the continuous parting of what occurs. Occasions, happenings are not merely the parting either because for them to happen, they have to take place within, for instance, the ever-receding line of time, or because the conditions of time-space are such that everything that could ever be is moving away from everything else, regardless of whether we can perceive this movement or not. In other words, it is not that parting or departing belongs to everything that happens by virtue of it having happened, which would make of parting an ontological condition of events that could be derived from the most elemental understanding of intratemporality. Rather, departure is the happening of an event itself. As such, Hamaker's sentence could be rendered more faithfully by a perhaps less faithful translation, such as departure is what occurs, which, unlike the phrase, what occurs is parting or departing, places the accent on the deconstitutive irony of eventhood itself, which is not to be thought on the basis of any modification of presence, however minimal. The eventuality of the event does not happen at some point and immediately begins to part ways, but its happening is such a parting of ways, such a splitting off from within. The conditions of eventhood outlined in this sententious sentence of Hamaker are thus not unlike those exposed by Peggy in her brilliant analysis of love and jealousy in the first part of Book of Addresses. Speaking of the tenuous relation between love and address, Peggy writes in the chapter Deconstruction and Love that love is an address without home, without the property of a subject from which it is sent, to which it returns. Love always brushes up against the uncanny, the unheimlich, which might also be translated for the occasion as unhomelike. Love brings with it the unhomelike because it is the experience of the sudden or not so sudden arrival of the other who expropriates address, which is to say appropriates it, exappropriates it. When I say I love, it is always a declaration of the other at my address. The other speaks in me and for me at my address and from the place of any possible mindness that could ever go by the name home. In so doing, the other renders such a mindness impossible, not only as a property or as any determination of my subjectivity, but also corrodes even the basis of my own power to be who I am, my own ipseity, my sein können, or simply put, my own Dasein. Likewise, the event of love in its sending destines me to err, exiles me from the realm in which everything that would have taken place could have been turned into a possible possession, into a possible possibility of my being, itself determined as a possibility to be. Likewise, the very event of that sending is itself deprived of the character of an event of appropriation, if we are to speak Heideggerian for a moment. In love, as in departure, it is not as if das Ereignis ist in its selber Enteignis. Appropriation is in itself expropriation, since the latter schema still retains the possibility of distinguishing between the proper and the ex-proper, in spite of insisting on their co-belonging. Rather, in love as in departure, as Peggy has taught us to think of this, the other arrives by departing me, by splitting me at my very eye, rendering this most natural home address unknown, uncanny, unhomely, impossible. The arrival of the other, the impossible unconditionality of its gift, is what is most eventful in any event, and may also be what is most occasional in every occasion, because it is a departure that never arrived as such, not even in a split second. Its happening is an unhappening before it is ever registered as a happening, since this event can only unfold at the blink of the eye, at the moment in which the lids are closed, in that, to quote Derrida, instant d'aveuglement qui assure à la vue sa respiration. It is one of Peggy's many merits to have insisted, perhaps more than anybody else in the wake of Derrida's thought, on the fact that deconstruction, if it is to be anything, must be the rigorous unfolding of the iterable singularity that persists, and I quote, as a singular force of insistence that breathes in and through the always generalizable text of exappropriation, that beats like the heart of the other in me, like the only possible heart that I could ever address as a loved one, and miss when its departure departs. To conclude, and as a type of countersign gift to Peggy, I would like to turn, as promised, to a poem of Julia de Burgos, Puerto Rico's most canonical 20th century poet. For lack of time, I will avoid saying anything about de Burgos' life and go straight to the matter at hand, but I will limit myself to letting you know that this poem, Partir, was written in a period of de Burgos' life that was marked by unimaginable forms of abjection. And yet, it is in the midst of this condition that something like survival emerges in her poetry, a poetics of survivance that is strikingly distant in tone from her earlier poems, which were decisively more morbid and suicidal. After the catastrophe, the poet claims to know what it is to depart, what partir is all about, and what is not to depart, not to part ways, what is not to separate oneself, what is not to say farewell. This knowledge is shared, compartido, as we would say in Spanish, and shared with a you, a tú, who is not so much the addressee of the poem as the companion of the poem's voicing. Moreover, this knowledge is not only shared to the extent that it is common to both the voice of the poem and the addressee, but also because it could always be imparted, impartido, by the poem to whoever reads its lines, regardless of whether they recognize or simply place themselves in the position of the addressee, who, according to the voice, also knows what partir is all about and takes part in the voice's imparting of this knowledge. Although the attainment of this knowledge regarding the essence of departure is already announced in the initial two stanzas of the poem, and although this knowledge seems to be already consolidated by the end of the third stanza, the truth of the essence of departure remains fraught with an opacity that becomes all the more opaque the more the poem tries to articulate this knowledge regarding what departure is and is not. There is irony in this opacity, for although the voice does not refrain from beginning the poem with a series of apophantic statements about departure, by the end of the poem, the very foundations of its own apodictic knowledge will be shaken to the core as soon as the we, formed by the voice and its co-operating addressee, are set to stand at odds with the word why, por qué, the operative and even operating word in all inquiries into the grounds of knowledge. If the first three stanzas set in motion a logic that claims to yield a knowledge of the essence of departure on the basis of the mutually exclusive character of simple negation and simple affirmation of yes or no, this gesture seems incapable of bringing to a close the field of possibilities out of which the essence of departure as such would have been established. It is the strangeness of this claim to knowledge about the being or the essence of departure that should keep us reading this poem for a long, potentially infinite time. Our reading will not be structured by the goal of explaining this strangeness away. Rather, we will try to let the poem unfold this precarious claim to know what departure is in all its precarity. Let us begin by reconstructing the partition that seems to secure the knowledge of what departure is, and let us do so by taking this voice at its word regarding its possession of this knowledge and its certainty, in a manner entirely in keeping with one of the foundational gestures of ontology, as it unfolds, for instance, in Parmenides' poem, in which the errant path of non-being has to be negated in order for the interlocutor of the goddess to be placed in the path that leads to being and knowledge. Partir begins with as a via negativa, characterizing the truth of the essence of departure by focusing on what departure is not. This negative path unfolds from the very first verse of the poem, though it is only in the second verse of the first stanza that the voice negates in the most explicit manner possible what she had already introduced as a form of departure. Partir sobre un guijarro no es partir, es dolorosamente la ausencia de la nada. By relying on the Spanish particle no to modify the Spanish verb ser in the third person indicative, the voice simply declares that to depart on a pebble, a line that I still cannot read either in Spanish or in English, is not to depart. Moreover, if the first and second lines of the opening stanza make this partition, the third line explains why this is so by qualifying the way of being of the non-departure with which the poem opens. The departure that takes its point of departure as its point of departure, the pebble, is not to depart. It's not a form of departure because its enactment only brings about the absence of the nothing. We will continue to turn around this peculiar oxymoronic form of absence. For the time being, let us simply note that, as in the negative theology of someone like Meister Eckhart, this form of non-departure nonetheless sustains an intimate relation to the proper essence that it dissimulates or covers up. Presenting itself as an apposition, the second stanza appears to add at least two more determinations to the privative structure of this pseudo-departure, demanding to be read as a continuation of the last verse in the first stanza, which reverses the negative direction of the poem's opening verse by saying something about what this non-departure actually is. Es dolorosamente la ausencia de la nada, separarse de todo lo que existe, inevitablemente confundirse con el más grande y único silencio. This mode of inessential departure not only coincides with this strange form of absence, but also with a kind of absolute separation, a distancing oneself from everything that exists, that paradoxically leads one to confuse oneself with the greatest and most unique silence. The English verb to confuse oneself is close enough to the Spanish verb confundirse to render what the Spanish verb conveys, because the English word not only intends the act of being confused, of making a mistake, or more attuned to this context, of mistaking oneself for something that one is not, but also because this word retains another sense of the term that is not as common in English, but resounds quite prominently in the Spanish, namely the sense of the act through which something fuses, mixes itself with, or blends itself into a larger body to the point of losing itself in the process. Moreover, note that this absence is not so much painful as it is painfully. The subtle difference between these two ways of reading this line is of crucial, if not unsurpassable importance, for any attempt to understand what this poem poetizes. Although it would be easy to translate the adverb dolorosamente, painfully, with the adjective painful, doing so would efface the adverbial character of this pain, which refers the pain back to the verb es, the third person singular conjugation of the Spanish verb ser, which along with estar encompass the same realm as that covered by the verb to be in the English language. The pain at stake here is not a property or a quality to be located in the absence itself. Instead, the experience of this painful departure here implicates the very being of this absence, understood neither as a logical copula that connects an absence with its pain, nor as the highest term within a static categorical ontology, but rather as a verbal movement. Is painfully names the very way of being of this absence, the very movement in which this absence comes to be. Pain, therefore, emerges in the very ontological movement through which this absence occurs itself. Absence is itself painfully. Already at this point, and perhaps unbeknownst to us, we have bumped against a difficulty that may seem intractable, if not even crippling, and that thus compromises our very attempt to receive the knowledge of departure and non-departure that this poem nonetheless claims to impart. For how could absence itself be as such, that is, within the context of this poem, be painfully, be as the very movement of pain, if absence seems to be on the side of non-being rather than of being, of non-presence rather than of presence? This difficulty becomes all the more difficult as soon as we take stock of two other aspects of this absence. First, that the voice here links this paradoxical form of absence to the very ontological movement of this false, untrue, or improper, or inauthentic form of departure. In fact, this absence and this non-departure coincide so much with each other that the latter is only insofar as it is the former, and vice versa. Conversely, both this absence and this departure can only be accessed in their ontological character as a verbal movement, which in turn can only be experienced in and through its painful unfolding, within the very core of the being of whoever pretends to be departing when they depart on a pebble, but instead have to bear painfully the burden of the absence of the nothing. It is for the sake of presenting the truth of the essence of departure that the voice not only has to articulate a dynamic ontology of pain, the being painfully that marks the experience of this form of non-departure as the very absence of the nothing. Non or quasi-departure is painfully the absence of the nothing. And yet it is only by confronting this co-implication, it is only by taking seriously the entanglement of non-departure, absence, being, and nothing that takes place in these opening stanzas, that we may begin to listen and perhaps understand the knowledge regarding the essence of departure that this voice is trying to share with us. Since I don't have time to unfold and interrogate this knowledge, allow me to make 3 quick points in order to conclude and sketch a reading of the rest of the poem. As the third stanza makes clear, true departure sustains an undeniable affinity with this pseudo-form of departure, in that both involve a separation from everything that exists. And yet in true departure, this separation from everything that is attains an even more intense degree of distance from the generalized field of ontology in which the verb to be amounts to be painfully. Yet it is this doubling of nothingness in this absence of the nothing, which coincides with the very being of non-departure as pain and with the pain of the ontological movement of non-departure, that provides us with the key to understand the complexity of this painful ontology of pseudo-departure. For it is precisely this strange absence that is not the absence of being, of something in general, but rather the absence of the nothing, that constitutes the very ground for the distinction of departure and non-quasi or pseudo-departure. It is thus this very is painfully that the essence of departure as a movement in which the nothing somewhat presences itself, if not presences itself, sets aside. Conversely, the other separation, the one that belongs to the proper or true form of departure, could only amount to the coming of the nothing from out of its ontological prison in which it has been detained. After its release, this nothing is no longer in the mode of its painful absence, an absence that gave free rein to the display of being in its achingly silent homogeneity. Rather, it is a nothing that presences itself in and as the echo, as the heart and the truth without distances, that binds together this anxiously and distressingly written voice and its addressee. Number 2, as the fourth and last stanza, which amounts to half of the poem, makes clear, at stake here is a rather strange form of knowledge of what departing, properly speaking, would be. If I mentioned Meister Eckhart before, it is because in a way this poem of Julia de Burgos stages a form of knowledge that belongs to an Eckartian vein, passing by, among other figures, Angelus Silesius, Jacob Böhme, Friedrich Schelling, and Martin Heidegger. Indeed, we could say that the main voice in the poem unfolds as shared self-knowledge of itself and its addressee as departed, that amounts to a parody of the famous lines from Silesius that Heidegger takes as a motto in his remarkable The Satz vom Grund. As is de Burgos was saying, we depart because we depart without why, without knowing why, that is, by breaking with the principium redente rationis that, as you surely recall, also involves a certain thinking of the nothing, nihil est sine ratione. As if de Burgos, responding to a Leibniz she may have never read, but who could swear after Leibniz not to have read what the proper name Leibniz indicates, were simply repeating nothing is without reason. The nothing, as it presences itself in departure, is without reason. Its knowledge is without why. Number 3. Finally, we come to the point that Peggy, of all people, has taught us to read, if this could be called a reading and not just mumbo jumbo. For the last lines of the poem point in the direction of an event linked to the arrival of another to which unconditional hospitality is due, without asking why that other continues to ask why. For the last words of the poem, uttered by the voice of a wind that comes after its demise, utters precisely the questioning word that the speakers of this poem would seem to have left behind. It is the persistence of the desire to ask this question, to utter this word, that remains perhaps the most enigmatic and most lovingly hospitable moment of translation in the poem. Indeed, when faced with a departure that could always harbor the threat of muteness, how not to ask why? And in asking why such departures happen, how not to be grateful for the time that remains. Thank you.
Thank you, Ronald. Our last speaker this morning is Ellen Burt, professor and chair of French and Italian at University of California, Irvine. Professor Burt's long-term interest is in literary texts as they infringe on the domains of philosophy and politics. She has pursued this interest in publications and teaching on questions such as censorship, the political practice of translation as disrupting the stable borders between national languages, the poetic language as legitimating and disruptive force, the city as battleground between official and unofficial memory, the drug experience as a metaphor and as socio-political problem, hospitality, the writing of the other in autobiography. Her first book, Poetry's Appeal, which was published by Stanford in 2000, investigated lyric poetry and its relation to the political in the 19th century. The overarching point was that poetry, while sometimes withdrawn from practical politics, is engaged with revisioning nature and thus with the new political forms dependent on ideas of nature. An important tool in her readings was the consideration of linguistic indeterminacy, a problem in poetic language that is central to the deconstructive readings of Derrida and de Man. A long interest in the hybrid texts of autobiography led to a second book on the representation of alterity in autobiography, Regard for the Other, published in 2009 by Fordham. This book claims that autobiography finds a relation to the other by way of its writing of the decisive moment of death, where the identity of the I is in question. Work by Derrida and Levinas on hospitality and The Secret provide much of the theoretical inspiration for the book. And she is currently working on a project centered on literary representations of animals in the 19th century city as key to its shifting understanding of the human. And I'll just say that after Ellen's words, we'll have a few minutes just for kind of informal discussion. Obviously, this is not a traditional academic symposium, but any kind of response, thoughts, reflections on what's been shared today. So please join me in welcoming Ellen Burt.
Thank you, Erin, and all who put this symposium together in honor of Peggy Kamuf And thanks first, last, above all, to Peggy.
Yeah, of course.
I've known Peggy for so long that I had a hard time picking through my memories to decide which parts of her long and illustrious career to celebrate, and which parts of my friendship I would try to give a public airing. I've ended with something of a hodgepodge, nothing quite so elaborate and elegant as David's double column. Bits of memory, bits of homage where the memory is kind of inflecting things, and bits of a paper, around an ability of Peggy's that's neither public nor private, but on the threshold between them. I want to celebrate Peggy's hospitality. I first met Peggy as a guest in the fall of 1978 while teaching as an ABD at Cornell, where Derrida had come to give a lecture. And as everywhere, but especially at Cornell with its School of Hospitality, Derrida's arrival was a signal for parties. During my year at Cornell, I don't think there was a weekend in town without at least one invitation to a gathering. But when Derrida was there, the parties heated up and people came from further off. Peggy, then a junior faculty member at Miami of Ohio, chose the occasion to return to Ithaca, and I found myself seated a few seats away at a crowded round table at Phil and Kathy Lewis's house in the country. I'd read and admired her first book on Rousseau, so I studied her kind of from the side. The table was jovial and the talk roved, but then there came a silence. Despite Derrida's remarkable politeness, a pall would sometimes come over the conversation. Perhaps it was the guests who would suddenly feel overawed, or maybe would stop to listen, interrupt their conversation to hear what kind of pearls might be dropping from his lips. Or maybe it was Derrida who would fall silent under the pressure of such listening. In any event, in leapt Peggy, who started a conversation about the farm that she and Jim Creech had bought, where they were raising various farm animals, including goats and sheep, I think, or chickens anyway. Peggy's talk of the farm would have been interesting in any event, but here it also added brightness to a lagging dinner party. The next night, at a big party at the Hertz's, there was Peggy again, this time talking lengthily with Derrida about his lecture. I admired the young faculty member of those two moments. She seemed a guest able to make an evening more convivial, but she could commandeer a corner at a loud party to hold an intellectual conversation. Peggy also knows how to host, of course, as anyone who's ever attended a dinner party at her house will understand. She's also terrific at hosting public events. Every summer, she's one of the primary convokers with Jeff Bennington of the week-long Derrida Seminar Translation Project meetings, where she really does the work of putting together the 8 younger scholars, weaving those junior faculty and graduate students in with the 8 older scholars and getting them to attend to one another. She also pays attention to the complex arrangements for the group to be received as guests at IMEC and in the foreign country of France, where there are various rules to be followed, keys to be taken care of, civilities to be attended to. I've seen plenty of evidence of Peggy's capacities of hospitality, but her savoir-faire with the conditional rules at IMEC is quite tremendous. When I tell you, for instance, that besides the hard work she puts into the editing and translating of the seminars, every year for the past 10 years, she's planned the week for 16 people from start to finish, including work, rooms, finances, transportation to and fro to Paris and around Normandy, and planning sessions for the future, and has set up a different excursion for an afternoon out, complete with a visit to some cottage industry making calvados or Pont-l'Évêque cheese, and a new restaurant on another beach to finish. You will agree that Peggy must have secretly taken a second degree when she was at Cornell at their famous hotel school. This year, Peggy has turned her genius to running a reading group at UCI Special Collections on Derrida's 1995 Hospitality Seminar. She brings a big group from USC, attracts attendees from UCI, and has cajoled the library into finding a locale and setting up the systems to make the sessions available virtually to people in Chile, Atlanta, New York, etc. Typical. Also typical is the fact that she thinks to give those listening a half an hour at the end to make their interventions. She's gotten the best amateur baker around to provide bread and the spread of vegetables and hummus to see us through the discussions, which are intense. Some reading groups go astray when participants use a passage as a springboard for speculation and then wander off. Peggy knows how to appreciate the speculative moves and then to bring the discussion back to the text. It helps that she's been following a distinction that Derrida comes to gradually between the conditional laws of hospitality and the unconditional law of hospitality. The result is a group operating in a complex space, reading group in a library, on a floor open only to the reading group at the time we're discussing, where Peggy welcomes all who show up, be it in person or virtually, in already this complex set of situation of hospitality, of being the host at another university, on a complex text about the same. She invites us into abysses of hospitality. So I want to dedicate the following paper to Peggy's hospitality, or rather, I will so dedicate it once it has become a little less inchoate and more worthy of its recipient. In signature pieces, Peggy has an essay on Rousseau's prose poem, The Levite of Ephraim. I had that in mind together with the question of absolute hospitality when I began thinking about Rousseau's ninth walk from the Reveries of the Solitary Walker, which sets itself under the sign of the casual hospitality of the street. You may know something about the complex, still partly obscure situation of state hospitality in which Rousseau wrote The Levite and the Reveries. I'm going to tell you about it because it's interesting, but also because you kind of need to know it in order to understand what's going on. Rousseau was from Geneva and was legally a bourgeois of that republic during much of his time in France. He was a case of what the 18th century called le droit des gens, that is, not just the law between nations, international law, but also the law covering the relation between foreign nationals and nations. As for the laws, so the laws covering the entrance and sojourn of foreign nationals were at that time quite relaxed. Nevertheless, Rousseau's welcome at the time he wrote the Reveries was precarious. For a while, his 1728 conversion to Catholicism would have favored his residence there. After his reintegration into the Calvinist Church and the Genevan bourgeoisie in 1754, his celebrity and friends in high places, friends on whose private hospitality he very often depended, would have kept him protected. But that situation of state, social, and domestic welcome changed in the 1760s, first clouded by the quarrel that broke out between Rousseau and the Diderot coterie, and then made stormy by the publication of Émile in France. Flouting France's censorship laws while thinking he was in compliance, Rousseau had published what turned out to be a scandalous book. The reaction was immediate. Émile was condemned and ultimately burned, while a warrant went out for Rousseau's arrest. He fled. Why did Rousseau not stay to face the music? Scholars have speculated about the reason for his flight, including, I think, Peggy in that piece. Obviously, a foreign national who had broken the laws in a position potentially more uncomfortable than a native son like Diderot, who had spent a few months in Vincennes for his writing some years earlier. But there were other circumstances, too. Rousseau had been living as a guest of the Duke and Duchess of Luxembourg in a house on their great estate. The confessions are somewhat cagey about the role that his hosts played, along with Malesherbes, at that time the magistrate charged with overseeing the censorship system and book trade, in the publication of Émile in France. Rousseau protested in the confessions that he had planned to publish it in Holland, believing it would fall afoul of the law in France. Whether, as he leads us to believe, his scruples about publishing in France were overcome, or rather his hosts and Malesherbes went ahead and published the work for him, he also leads us to believe that, presenting him more or less than with a fait accompli. At any rate, his continued sojourn would have been difficult. Had he stayed, Malesherbes and his ducal hosts would easily have been swept up in the scandal. That members of the aristocracy and a high magistrate had contributed to the illegal act was certain. That they had even dragged him to commit it, almost without his knowledge, and so exposed their guest, along with his forbidden book, to the rigors of French laws, is probable. His French hosts would have been embarrassed were Rousseau arrested, and especially were his papers confiscated. Rousseau fled. In this backstory, you can glimpse elements of trespasses against hospitality that might have affected Rousseau's choice to write on the terrible story from judges of rape, murder, and dismemberment, that is, the Levite of Ephraim, as he fled. The hosting nation, represented in the person of Malzerbe, and the hosting social group and domestic group, represented by the Luxembourg family, can appear as persecutors, whose means of ridding themselves of a tiresome guest were just short of diabolical. Were there a court that could impose sanctions on those who break the laws of hospitality, did international law align with those laws, this would appear a case worthy of hearing by that court. When, after some long years of wandering, Rousseau was again received in Paris in 1770, it was under conditions. Perhaps his early protectors had a hand in his return. In any case, one can see that there would have been every reason at every level of hospitality, or some reason at every level of hospitality, national, social, and domestic, for holding close this enemy guest, by then known to be writing his confessions. The means for disarming him were at hand. One condition of his welcome may have been an introduction to publish. It's known that Rousseau had an interview with the police after reading aloud a portion of his confessions in a private house, after which further readings were suspended. Certainly, too, the last works that Rousseau wrote while in Paris, the Dialogues and the Reveries, were not published in his lifetime. Another condition, if we are to believe Rousseau, who is often the only authority for these last years, was that he was set under surveillance by police spies. He claims that his lodgings were fitted with a special kind of lock, secret, which meant that visitors had to check in with his neighbors to gain access. As Rousseau says in the Dialogues, those neighbors have their instructions and orders. But paranoid at the time, right? As a result of these conditions, even or especially at home, Rousseau appears in a public character. He is an alien deprived of anything but the space determined and overseen by the hosting nation. His public character is to appear in the strictly private character of the master of a domestic space. Yet that character of privacy is itself overseen by the special lock, his landlord, the neighbors, the police about him, and his own paranoid sense of precarious welcome. Although he appears as master of his apartments, the one in charge of its hospitality, in reality he is far from having power over it. His domestic privacy no longer fully under his control or supervision, he is forced to assume the public character of an erstwhile public personage, now tolerated only on condition of living very privately. The blurring of public and private in these conditions made them exceptional enough to justify, perhaps, Rousseau's comparison of his situation to that of one fallen onto an alien planet. In this situation of life lived within boundaries much encroached upon by the state, the solitary walker is driven outside to be alone, according to a logic that Derrida describes in the 1991 seminar that I've given you a little passage from, and that Alyssa Martyr was responsible for getting us permission to bring out fairly recently. Derrida explains that the incognito gives the very public personage the possibility of mingling with the crowd, of visiting public places like exhibitions as if they were private citizens, and there to extend and mark the difference between public and private. And here's the quote, "And the space of the crowd, the space of this crowd so hospitable to the incognito, and so apt for hyperbolizing the private by hyperbolizing the public, the space of the crowd perhaps has a privileged relation with the very element of literature. That's the space where I can myself be incognito, recount fictively what is most private without its being attributed to my public person, or rather to my publicly private person." The incognito lies in a strange area, one that persists beyond or comes before the division of public and private, one where hyperbolic publicity allows for hyperbolic privacy. In the passage just cited, the freedoms and pleasures of the incognito are associated with a very intimate autobiographical writing. The space of the incognito is, I repeat Derrida, where I can recount fictively what is most private without its being attributed to my public person, or rather to my publicly private person. His comments concern the painter of modern life and refer, of course, to Constantin Guy and to Baudelaire, but it is also relevant to Rousseau as he walks the city and applies the barometer to his soul in the Reveries. He too recounts fictively his most private acts and thoughts, his secret life insofar as it still remains secret, not only to those in and about his apartment, Rue Plâtrière, who visit or watch the comings and goings, but even to himself. It's into an early version of the crowd that Rousseau can escape the blurred lines of his welcome and travel outside to question and to redraw in some way the limits. Rousseau's walks outside the house are thus curiously his moments of utmost privacy. It's there where his persona is that of anyone in a crowd, out in public, visible to all, who can move about as unknown, free to be himself, and to let his ideas follow their bent without resistance or constraint. That's a quote from Rousseau. So the passage from Derrida is opposite in that it describes the problem Rousseau faces and the solution he adopts as a result of his situation as conditional guest. It's worth noticing as well because Derrida, somewhat loosely, says that the crowd is hospitable to the incognito. That means there's a difference between the anonymity of the crowd, which hosts the incognito, and the case of the guest wearing the mask of the incognito, who looks familiar enough to welcome an anonymous one like the others, but is, as incognito, actually different. Still, the usage is loose enough, or I call it loose, sorry, because it seems hard to think of hospitality without an inside-outside distinction, where the host is a crowd and the guest is a public personage who may be known but is not acknowledged. What does it mean to be received in such circumstances? In describing conditional hospitality, Derrida talks or says that it involves determinate protocols. For instance, a threshold, a gate, a door, a master of the house, an invitation, a questioning, a series of identifying procedures, a ceremony of welcome or gift giving, a fixed length of stay, etc. The very public space of the multitude has none of these. When it opens to take in the incognito, we see no threshold or portal, no master of the house, no conditions set, no gestures of identifying the guest or host by an invitation, welcome, or ceremony of gift giving. The crowd takes in the incognito casually without acknowledging or even knowing necessarily that it has done so. In this, it is perhaps closer to hospitality, or to that hospitality that Derrida terms absolute and unconditional, rather than to conditional hospitality with its given context and set of laws. The unconditional law of hospitality commands that one, quote, this is from Derrida, and I didn't give it to you, give to the one arriving one's whole home and one's self, give one's proper self, our proper self, without asking his name or for a counter gift or for him to fulfill the slightest condition, end quote. The hospitality of the crowd is not exactly absolute hospitality, of course, since as casual, as case, it is other than absolute. And yet it is not covered by conditions, but takes place outside the public-private conditions that are so heavily policed in Rousseau. I think it fair to say that for Rousseau, at any rate, makes it a placeholder for absolute hospitality, which he otherwise nowhere addresses, but which his status as persona non grata, nonetheless made welcome, invites us to consider. Note, too, that it is the incognito that gives the city phenomenon of the crowd a certain consistency as something more than an anonymous mass. In the incognito received by the crowd, there is privacy and publicity unaccounted for by the already publicized structures of public and private. The incognito wanders outside and ahead of available models of that distinction in the avant-garde. Rousseau wrote his Reveries as he walked, drafting them on the backs of playing cards. We can start to understand this odd gesture. On the one side, no doubt there's a practical reason. He just wants to seize his intimate life as he lives it, and dreaming is hard to seize otherwise. Write it down right away. As he says in the second walk, these hours of solitude and meditation are the only ones in the day where I am fully myself and for myself, without diversion, without obstacle, and during which I can truly claim to be what nature willed. On the other side, Rousseau traces a new line between private and public by the act of writing out where everyone can see him, writing that he cannot publish. He publishes without publishing, and that he is outside the reach of the law in doing so. The hospitality offered by the crowd lets him draw a frontier between public and private differently than it is being imposed upon him by his hosting nation, all the while that he's being tracked by the police, one of whose tactics, used by the solitary walker himself, is to lift his incognito from time to time, as if to check or put a check on such hyperbolizing of public and private spaces. In a longer version of this paper, still to be written, I will treat 2 episodes from the 9th walk that involve the lifting of the incognito. Both show Rousseau imagining fictions related to threshold moments of casual hospitality that excite his reverie and make hospitality a model of sorts. Thus, a child's embrace lets him fantasize a paternity modeled on casual, or paternal feelings at any rate, modeled on casual hospitality. The greetings of some soldiers let him construe fellowship as hospitality, not as a one-sided assembly of like fellows, but as welcoming a difference to be accommodated rather than reduced. In both cases, the lifting in the incognito sets off autoimmune responses in which the solitary walker with his fiction is treated as an enemy. I want to speak only briefly here of an episode at the end of the walk where the incognito is not pierced and there seems to be a successful modeling. Rousseau explains that at last he has a chance to talk with one who's just a human being. I took advantage of this anonymity, this incognito, to talk or to converse for a few moments with a man. The context of the casual hospitality here requires explanation, to begin with because it does not occur during a walk, but on a ferry ride across the Seine to the island of the Swans, where the solitary walker plans to stroll. This was an island that lay in the Seine between the Invalides and the Champ de Mars. The island was soon to disappear, for the lettre patente that gave permission to fill in the channel that separated from the left bank had already been signed. It's where the Musée du Quai Branly is at present. At the time Rousseau wrote, however, the spot was an island still, attached to the left bank only by a bridge. In short, it was a literal site where the city's internal border was in process of transformation. As for the event and anecdote, Rousseau gives them pride of place. The casual hospitality offered occurs dead in the middle of Paris, where the vertical axis Rousseau has been tracing crosses the horizontal axis of the Seine. The anecdote is set at the very end of the walk and almost at the end of the book. For once, the solitary walker is the host, not the guest stranger received by the city. While the scene does not start as a scene of hospitality, it becomes so at a moment when the boat arrives on the island and the walker decides to pick up the cost of the crossing and to help his fellow traveler ashore. The scene is thus transformed into a scene of hospitality by the walker's transformation into a host. What explains this transformation? How does an incognito person, alien on a foreign planet, know that this is the right moment to welcome home his fellow passenger? Into what home does the incognito master of the house welcome him? Perhaps the key can be found in the description of the fellow passenger guest, who is, quote, un pauvre vieux invalide, a poor old disabled veteran, as Butterworth translates it. That translation makes perfect sense given the larger context of a walk taken in the direction of the military institution of the Invalides, the old soldiers' home, and within the context of the military presence throughout the walk. But the boat lands on the island of the Swans. The French name of the island, l'île aux Cygnes, is arresting, particularly since Rousseau spells it Cygne, C-I-G-N-E-S, with an I, so that the word not only sounds like, but looks like the French word for signs, signe. The context of signs and language is critical here. Pauvre vieux invalide assembles 3 words that share the peculiarity of being nominalized adjectives. Any one can serve as adjective, and any one can serve as noun. What is the noun? Identifying the man the walker makes his guest. Is he primarily a disabled veteran, or an old man, or a poor man? Do the qualifying adjectives additionally deprive him of money, youth, or health and limbs? Is he a veteran at all? He could be a poor old veteran. Maybe he's a poor old disabled man, unless he's a poor disabled old man. Possibly he might even be an old and disabled poor man. The context of the Invalide suggests a disabled veteran, but here on Sign Island, the language becomes slippery and the identity of the companion impossible to fix. All of these identities are revealed and attended to by the walker as he enjoys the company of a human stripped of all social qualifiers, disabled as one without social role or knowledge of place, with only a few miserable pennies in his pocket, an old man older than the walker. The issue is not simply that of determining whether the man belongs in the public context, Paris circa 1776, or in the private one of Rousseau's intimate autobiographical writing with its dreaming around signs. It's also a matter of the man in whom the incognito walker recognizes a guest with himself as host. His largesse is offered to one whose identity is up for grabs, whose state of deprivation is obvious, but whose claim to succor in 18th century France is not. We can understand this in terms perhaps of recognition. The incognito dreamer recognizes in the bare human one who is like himself outside the city structures and its conditional hospitality. You can take that figuratively, but also literally. The veterans have an institution to help them, but what of a poor old man, an old man, a disabled man, a man unidentified and unidentifiable by way of social class, family, or nation? It's as if the host were receiving a guest in a situation of extreme deprivation, whose suffering is and is not like his. In a passage that evokes the river Styx and the payment made to the boatman Charon, that oboe paste to be placed in the mouth of the dead one before burial, it's even possible to see the man as stripped of life. The extension of hospitality to bare mortal humanity suggests precisely the situation of absolute hospitality, where the host receives the arriving one without question, without procedures, without asking for name or papers. Here, Rousseau is taking advantage of the incognito to spin a fiction that is hyperbolic with respect to the hospitality we will find in Kant's 1795 treatise on perpetual peace. For Kant, who sets aside hospitality as philanthropy, hospitality is rather a natural right, a result of man's perfectibility and the world's roundness. Because of perfectibility, man must be able to enter temporarily into commerce with other humans so as to be able to realize his possibilities. But Rousseau makes hospitality depend on the second of the two capacities he ascribes to man in nature, namely pity. Pity depends upon resemblance while recognizing and preserving the difference between the sufferer and the one doing the pitying. Just so, here there is a difference between the man who enjoys an excessive privacy within a glaring publicity, the incognito, and the anonymous man with his want of identity or determination. The heart's hospitality, as Rousseau says in the final words, is offered by pure humanity, pity, which does not reduce difference. A hospitality that takes in the other without reducing difference is very close to pity, rather than the one that occurs within the confines of a natural right meant to enable commerce and perfectibility, and then can be set up by a given state, society, or family with limits and conditions. For Rousseau, the incognito offers hospitality neither out of philanthropy nor in a rational act based on natural right as guarantor of commerce. As he lays it out here, hospitality is driven by pity and recognizes difference. Excuse the very bad pun, it's hospitality. Let me say in hasty conclusion that Peggy's hospitality, while of the conditional sort, has about it something of the fabulous and hyperbolic. I think of her most recent guests, the two feral kittens she has taken in, as if the yes to the arriving one had to stretch beyond un homme to include the animal. Or I think of the abysses of hospitality into which she has led the reading group at Irvine with a simple invitation to read the hospitality seminar with her every other Monday at UCI. I've tried to give a glimpse of just one such abyss, giving thanks to Peggy.
so much, Ellen, Ronald, and David, to give Peggy an opportunity to respond. Does that sound like something you'd like to do?
I'll try. First, humble thanks and gratitude to Erin and Aki and Natanya and all those who helped them. Ronald put this together. It's really. I knew it was going to be a strange experience, but it's also heartwarming. And I have to, I'm probably going to confess some embarrassing things, and which is both Aki and David and now Ellen recounted moments of first encounter, which I totally forgot. I mean, that is embarrassing for me, and that's what I have to confess. But it's also, I'm so happy to have retrieved those memories, thanks to you three. Ronald didn't recount our first encounter, and I don't remember it. So,
I can.
But I do appreciate being put back into those moments that I remember the general scenes that each of you evoked, but not the words exchanged or that was the first time I met each of you. But and Ronald, I have to say that last night when I said something about the recently departed, that and you said you were going to be talking about departure a lot. I think I've heard you speak about this poem before, and it is a very touching poem. That's not the right word, but and I really appreciate your addressing it again and addressing departure. And I was thinking about that whole vocabulary of depart, impart, take part, be part of, and it also connects up with the hyphen and that joins and separates, or the separation. And of course, the French word partage, since you mentioned Nancy and his partage des voix, which is one of those words that, like the hyphen, both joins and separates, but also shares out, but divides. So these are random thoughts. I thought you were going to say more about Le Lévite d'Ephraim, but I'm glad you didn't, because once again, I've totally forgotten that. I mean, I remember the Rousseau text better than what I might have risked saying about it, which would have been, I'm sure, so much less informed than whatever you could have brought to it. But clearly, I mean, we were talking about it recently because it comes up in the hospitality seminar where Jacques refers to the passage from Judges right at the end of the last session we were talking about, I think. And I go, oh yeah, that text, I remember that text, but the Rousseau text, rather. So yeah, there were lots of other notes that I made here, which I'll probably just pass along to you in a passing strange way. Yes, it's, as we continue to talk. But thank you again.
We have a few more minutes. If any of you would like to respond, any thoughts, reflections, spontaneous interpretations of poetic texts.
Hi, thank you for everything. I wanted to sort of go back to Ronald, the quote that you had at the beginning, where you talked about love and how it's the German quote, how Liebe ist unheimlich, I think, because you talked about unheimlich as uncanny, sort of, right? But at the same time, I, of course, also thought that heimlich in German not only means homely, but also secret. So secrets are kind of what is in the home, right? So I was kind of wondering if, like, what you would think, like, how would that sort of your translation or interpretation, how would that change if you switched unheimlich from uncanny or unhomely to non-secret in a way, right? So there's like a hyphen sort of creeping into German, which I guess kind of doesn't use hyphenation a lot. And then, of course, I'm sort of trying to, like, I'm connecting this kind of to this notion of being incognito in the crowd, which we kind of had in the third presentation, which was kind of like what does it mean to be secret in public, to sort of be homely in public, right? So yeah, I was just kind of curious what you, like, if that would change anything in interpretation.
Go for it. Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, so the passage is a passage from Peggy's Deconstruction on Love. So I'm tempted to like tell Peggy how that would change if she were to translate on home like unheimlich as also, let's say, on secret or something like that, or on secretly. But I do think there's something, I mean, there's a way in which even that passage as it goes on can be productively read precisely in the terms that you outline. Because of course, like the aporia of the secret is that the secret is not secret, but it is like, you know, it's secreted, right? Le secret c'est secret. Well, I don't know how you would say it, but so there's a certain way in which what is most interesting about the motif of secrecy in Derrida, but in other thinkers as well, it has to do with the fact that it is not hidden or it's not concealed, or that it sustains a different relationship with the lexicon of something that is visible or invisible, or something that is, let's say, of the order of the phenomenal, or of that which needs to not phenomenalize itself in order for phenomena to appear phenomenally. And I think that is also one of the reasons why what Peggy does with appropriation and exappropriation in that precise moment is very important. Because, I mean, the lexicon of appropriation and exappropriation is a very Heideggerian lexicon. But Derrida twists that lexicon in places like monolingualisme de l'autre to precisely talk about something like a secrecy that is no longer of the order of a secret around which no one would have been able to, let's say, build a negative theology discourse, partly because it is disseminated, it's scattered, it is it's partagé, and not only just partagé, but in a certain way inaccessible as well, and inaccessibility that is not necessarily of a theological order or principle. I don't know if this is something helpful, but I do think that I mean, in a certain way communicates with two moments which I thought if I had not done such a sloppy job with the Julia Burgos poem, like, I mean, I would have done something closer to what you pointed when Peggy both insists to Nancy and to Gachet, on the singularity of the idiom, and Nancy about something that is, you know, when in this kind of communitarian, partagey kind of like a drive, something remains in a certain way excluded. I mean, in a certain way, that's maybe precisely the secret, which survives the constitution of some sort of like being with, right? I don't know. I mean, I'm rambling, so I will let Ellen or David talk.
But it seems to me that your question is evoking the beginning of Freud's essay, where he goes through the that heimlich can mean both secret and the most familiar, and you know, that kind of contradictory meaning of the word, and he works through it like for 4 or 5 pages. He doesn't get out of the dictionary, the German dictionary of heimlich, unheimlich. So unheimlich means also heimlich, and heimlich means also unheimlich, and this is where he begins the whole essay.
Were there more responses, or shall I?
Yeah.
So far we've learned 2 things: that Peggy has incredibly smart and interesting friends, and secondly, that she doesn't remember.
It's because we've always known her.
Because we've always known her. And it made me think, in listening to these 3 remarkable papers, all of them moving between this space of the personal and the intimate, from the first, I was trying to think, you know, the first and second name, the first and last name, departure to the incognito, something like a profile of what Peggy has meant to us in so many ways. I think they, you know, in Japanese, because they write this way, you know, they refer to the upper name and the lower name. You know, so when you talked about organizing the paper and then having to listen or overhear the kind of transition in David's presentation between the Peggy that will be intimately involved in organizing your life in so many ways, and then the Kamuf who is organizing one's thought, the kind of hospitality that both of you met, the passage or the being apart, which is also to be a part of, but to be a part, as David has done, changing the names, and to really imagine and remember for myself the moment where there was this, you know, at Series Z, there is an energy which is, you know, it's exhilarating and it's also exhausting. And Peggy's there sort of at the center, but also she's the opening, right? Lets people in. I mean, it's like being snuck in through the back. You know, someone props the door open and lets you in. And that space kind of resonated in each of the presentations, and especially around this ambiguity of what you call the loose hospitality of the crowd. Right? You are in this space that welcomes you unconditionally and conditionally at the same time. And it struck me that this is we are really talking about Peggy. Right? This is really the kind of space that she enables. There is this singularity, even though she doesn't remember us. that is unique to us. That's the address, the specificity of it. And yet you feel, and I was really struck by David's phrasing with that, suddenly there was a community, right? Just the 3 of you, Derrida and Peggy, and you suddenly feel the part. And I think people who have had this opportunity to be around Peggy, to share space, to do certain things, to be involved, to participate, really, another partir, to participate, you feel this sense suddenly that there is a community, you know, almost a kind of Beckettian way. You know that this community will have to be defended, and yet you feel that you are part of this community. Sorry, this isn't taking the shape of a question, but it was just a series of reflections that each of your papers sort of so brilliant, and listening in particular to the idiom that moves in each of your cases, I think, between a kind of a challenge to produce a certain kind of rhetoric or structure that accommodates, let's say, both the personal and when David said, this is what Peggy does for me, you know what I mean? It really becomes hard to imagine my case as well, whether my debt to her is as a friend, as an inspiration, a mentor, but she literally brought me here to the place where I am professionally as well. And this, there has to be a word for it. There has to be some trope that we would name somehow around Peggy. I'm sorry, these are nothing more than a series of improvisations.
It was a very selfish thing.
Anyone else? Okay, so before we take a lunch break, I'd like to invite Sherry Velasco, who is our interim divisional vice dean for the humanities in USC Dornsife. Did I get it right? Who would like to share a few words?
I am really, really happy to join you on behalf of the USC Dornsife Dean's Office, but mostly as a really grateful colleague. Of course, this is a bittersweet moment for us, celebrating Peggy's tremendous career, while reconciling that our esteemed colleague is pursuing new adventures in the life of the mind. Very few of us have called USC our home for 30 years, and very few make such an indelible mark on the humanities at this institution and beyond. Over the years, Peggy has been incredibly generous in her service to multiple departments, the college and the university. She has served on almost every department, Dornsife, and university committee, including the Humanities Personnel Committee, the College Humanities Budget Committee, the College Committee on Graduate Studies in the Humanities. You see a theme here? The University Research Committee, the Faculty Council as a Humanities Representative, UCAPT, and many, many others. The list goes on. She served as chair for both comparative literature and director of graduate studies in both Colt and French and Italian, and as you all know, the inaugural director of our comparative studies in literature and culture graduate program. Having recently served as chair of French and Italian as an outsider visiting from Spanish and Portuguese, I had the unique opportunity to see up close the impact that Peggy's leadership legacy had. From the inside, it was clear that Peggy's vision for the French program, as well as Colt and CSLC, laid the intellectual foundation for building strengths in these fields. She has, I can tell you from my own personal experience, the bar is so high, and it's not just in scholarly work. Administratively, I really learned a lot from you, and I'm so grateful. It's now our responsibility to continue her commitment to and insistence on cultivating both rigor and innovation in all our academic programs. Most of you know Peggy's reputation as a scholar. Her expertise in Derrida, translation theory and practice, and continental philosophy in particular are unmatched. She's a gifted writer who's produced numerous seminal works. I could list all her publications, honors, and contributions to the Academy, and we would all be starving by the time I finished. So I'll leave that. But I do want to mention some of the achievements that are not fully captured on a CV. Peggy's international reputation is largely responsible for attracting some of the best graduate students from around the world. She spearheaded the hiring of several renowned faculty, many of whom were pursued by highly competitive peer institutions. She directed a massive and successful restructuring of the comparative literature major and minor, reinvigorating these degree programs at a time when the liberal arts nationwide were losing ground to professional and vocational schools. She's known among colleagues as a generous mentor to junior faculty across a range of disciplines. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of Peggy's career is her fundamental approach to the humanities. She commits to adding both broad range and depth of scholarship across many interrelated areas. In doing so, she provides us with surprising new knowledge and nuanced context. She inspires us all to reconceive our roles as scholars within our specific disciplines as well as the Academy at large. There's a quote from Derrida that many of you know, but I thought was appropriate for us today. He said, "Within the university, you can study without waiting for any efficient or immediate result. You may search just for the sake of searching and try for the sake of trying. So there's this possibility of what I would call playing. It's perhaps the only place within society where play is possible to such an extent." Peggy, I sincerely hope that your years at USC, you've been able to do just as much play in the dreaming sense as you have work. Thank you so much for your dedication to the USC community, and I'm so happy to join everybody and wishing you a retirement that brings great happiness.
Thank you, Sherry. We'll now take a break for lunch. Lunch will be served just in the lobby area where we had coffee. You can feel free to eat inside or outside, make yourself comfortable. We'll meet again in this room at 2 p.m. for the first afternoon session. Thanks again.